John Flay wasn't a convict. He came out belonging to Mr. Tanner because he was a wealthy man and was able to bring out so many sheep and so many servants, and then you were given land if you brought a certain amount of capital out
Yes,
with you.
so he was sort of a bribed migrant.
Yeah.
And he was...
And he arrived out here in the 1830s, so it was early on, and he was 17 years old. He was illegitimate and illiterate.
Oh,
And on the ship at the same time coming out was a little housemaid named Jane, and she was a year older than he was, so she was 18 to his 17. And after they'd been here a year, Jane and John married. And John was a very good shepherd. Mr. Tanner took up land near York, and John was a very good shepherd, and he was allowed to have the second of any twins that were born, and he gradually built up a little flock of sheep of his own and sold them on and got a little bit more money. And he had 6 sons and 2 daughters, and by the time he died, he left 3 farms that he owned and 3 farms that he leased to his 6 sons. Every son had a farm by the time the old man died, and he was only 58 when he died.
wow.
Now his oldest son was named James, and there weren't very many women in the colony. So they sent James back to England to get a wife. And on the ship on the way over, he'd made friends with one of the ship's engineers, who said, "Oh, I've got a daughter. You know, you can have her." So when they arrived in England, they were in London, and James went to meet the daughter, whose name was Margaret Johnson. And she didn't have a lot of choice in the matter because, poor darling, she was plain as a plate. And they were married and came back out here to Western Australia, and she lived the rest of her life in terror. Poor lady, she was terrified of the place.
Really?
She was terrified of the emptiness, and she was terrified of the bush. She was terrified of the Aboriginal people because she'd never seen them, of course. Yeah, must have been very, very hard for her. And she had...
And their last name was Flay.
Flay.
F-L-A.
E-A-Y.
E-A-Y, okay.
And she had... Golly...
Puppies?
I think 5 sons and a couple of daughters, and one of her daughters was Sarah Jane, who was Grandpa's mother.
Ah.
That's where it all fits in.
Yes, and Grandpa is your father.
Yeah.
Yes. Interesting.
Yeah.
So we could look up the Flays.
Yeah. And if you want a bit of real history, if you want to know how quickly you can go back in time, Grandpa's father, who was Bumpy...
Is that a characteristic you're describing there, or a name?
Yeah, no, that was his nickname.
Oh, fair enough.
Bumpy. So Bumpy was born in 1860, and his mother can remember an old man in the village when she was a little girl who had fought at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815.
Wow.
So that hops you back, doesn't it?
It certainly does, yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yes. So there you are.
Did Grandpa ever go to any wars?
No, Grandpa was he was too young for the First World War, and then he was actually getting on towards getting too old for the Second World War, but he was what they called man-powered. Farmers who were growing food, not only for us but for Britain, of course, they weren't conscripted into the army. They were what they called man-powered onto the land.
Sort of communist style, where you work and you work damn hard.
It was called essential work.
Right.
Manpower was essential work, and farming was classified as essential work. If he'd had a son who was of army age, the son would have gone into the army. But no, Grandpa. But his older brother did, Barney, and Barney was killed in New Guinea.
Yeah, and then Grandpa never liked the Japanese after that, I believe.
Oh, crumbs, no.
Because obviously...
None of them did.
Obviously Barney was killed by the Japanese. Yes.
Barney was shot by a sniper. They'd only just arrived. His ship had only just arrived at, I presume, Milne Bay. I'm not sure about the actual location. And they were really just disembarking.
Right.
And,
that's a bit dishonourable, you might say.
Anything goes
it's
for a
war.
sniper.
It is war, yeah.
Anything goes for a sniper.
SAS almost.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting how Japan has gone from being a formidable aggressor to epitomising cute these days. Have you noticed that? That's their buzzword, their catchphrase, their idol almost.
Yeah, well, after the shock of the end of the war, because that was the most terrible, terrible loss of face for them. That's why they despised the British Army so
Well, and they
much.
always had honour in the samurai and things, yes.
Because the British Army surrendered, and the Japanese absolutely despised them.
And they, no
Fancy
quarter.
Exactly, fancy surrendering. They should have fought until they were all dead. You know. To surrender was a very dishonourable thing to do. And then when they were defeated at the end, of course, that was just all too terrible for words. For them.
So when did the British surrender to the Japanese?
1940, the fall of Singapore. 1941?
Oh,
No,
41, yes.
41, I think.
So this was Second World War then? But then how come the war didn't end with Britain losing?
Because Japan was advancing. Japan, the fall of Singapore, that all of those men then went into the prison camps, Changi and places like that.
Oh, I
And
see.
built the Burma Railway. And that whole
Right,
thing.
right.
Japan had advanced into Burma, because Burma was a British colony in those days. Burma belonged to Britain. And Japan was advancing into Burma. They took most of New Guinea. The Australians halted them in New Guinea
Yes, with the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels.
with the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, and the ones that the Kokoda Trail and all that sort of stuff. Those blokes weren't even regular army; they were militiamen, what we would call reserve. They were only semi-trained.
Yeah.
But
Guerrilla warfare.
the thing was, the Japanese weren't any better off. What we think of how our fellows suffered, but so did the Japanese, because they didn't have any supply lines. They were practically starving, and they did resort to cannibalism.
Yeah, I
They
was going to say, I heard rumours about cannibalism.
They had no choice. They had no food.
Did they eat each other or us?
I think they ate us actually, but
Yeah.
nobody sort of talks about it much. It's
No.
not. I don't know for sure, but the rumour always is that they did.
It's not as if Papua New Guinea's a stranger to that kind of thing anyway.
No, exactly.
So
You're
locals
right,
probably
you're
show
right.
them how to fillet and...
But then by the time, that was when the Americans came in.
Right. So-
Our history teacher always told us, because this was in the sort of 1950s, so it was only 10 years later when I was learning all this. She said, never forget that it was the Australians that turned the tide. She said, if you watch all the Second World War films about the Pacific War, it's always the Americans who did everything.
And Pearl
She said-
Harbor. It's all about Pearl Harbor.
She
Yes.
said, never forget that the Australians turned the tide in New Guinea, and the Americans, thank goodness, came in behind and helped us mop up. We couldn't have done it on our own because we didn't have enough men.
No. Yes, well, I think the thin red line is what scares me the most. That they'd basically written off the top of Australia and said, Japan can have this, we're going to bunker down in the lower half.
Well, never mind the lower half. They'd written off Western Australia and South Australia as well.
Really?
They drew a line from just north of Sydney
Yeah.
to just
So we're
to
just
the
going
west
to keep
of Melbourne.
Canberra.
They were just going to keep that corner there.
Yeah.
The rest of us were.
Well, we really have to. We haven't got enough population to really defend our borders
we
in
haven't.
any way.
And Granny and all the mothers on the farms and everything, they were all under instruction. If the invasion came, because the warships got down as close as Rottnest, don't forget, just off Rottnest. Not a fleet, but just a couple of ships got as far as Rottnest.
Wow.
And the farmers' wives were all instructed. They had all these weird old cars. Load the car up, load the children up, and drive into the desert. Just drive.
Into the desert.
Just drive east. And the men would be left to try and hold some sort of a line.
Ooh.
They were all absolutely terrified.
As you would be.
Well,
Yeah.
Granny, I was born in 1940, so she had a baby, and
Yeah.
2 other little girls, and one pretty crappy old car.
Yeah.
And the trouble about that is it would be all right if it had happened in winter, but it happened in summer. There's no water out there.
No.
What do you do?
Load the car up with as much as you've got and sort of try to do a Jesus-style recreating of it. Yeah.
Find a bore somewhere.